All right, so today we're going deep on something pretty crucial, I'd say. The U.S. plan for handling, you know, oil spills and hazardous substances. You're interested in that. National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan. How that works. We're going to unpack that for you.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful, though. We usually just call it the NCP.
Yeah, it is. But it's really fascinating how this plan has kind of evolved over time.
Yeah.
We're actually looking at the official document here. That's 40 CFR Part 300 in the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, if you want to get technical.
Yeah.
And, it's been updated as recently as last month.
Wow. So it's not just some dusty old document. It's a living guide. They're always refining it.
Exactly. And that's because the types of, environmental emergencies it covers are so diverse. I mean, you can think about everything from oil tanker spills to like leaking chemical drums.
Right.
Even situations involving radioactive material.
Yeah. Radioactive, huh?
Yeah.
It's kind of mind-boggling to think about the range of scenarios this plan has to address. So let's break it down. What is the core purpose of the NCP?
At its heart, the NCP is all about minimizing the damage these events can cause, both to public health and the environment. And the scope is huge, Navigable waters, shorelines, even incidents on the high seas if they're tied to U.S. jurisdiction.
So,
Yeah.
if we have a massive oil tanker spill off the coast, I mean, it's a chaotic scene with potential impacts kind of rippling outward. How does the NCP bring order to that chaos?
Well, first off, it establishes a clear organizational structure for the response. So you've got the National Response Team, the NRT, made up of folks from different federal agencies. Then you have regional response teams, the RRTs, for more localized coordination.
So you got teams on a national and a regional level, but who's actually out there in the thick of it, making the tough calls on the ground?
That would be the on-scene coordinators, the OSCs, and the remedial project managers, the RPMs. They're the ones leading the response efforts and making critical decisions in real time.
So they're the ones on the front lines. It's a team effort. Now what is? You're just an everyday person.
Yeah.
And you witness something like, an oil sheen on the water. Can you actually play a role in activating this whole response system?
Absolutely. The NCP encourages public involvement. You can report any spill or suspected release to the National Response Center, the NRC. It's a 247 hotline, kind of like an environmental 911.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. It makes you feel like you can actually do something if you see a problem. Now, let's say someone reports an oil spill. What happens next? How does this plan actually unfold?
So the NCP lays out a very specific process for oil removal operations. It all starts with phase-on, discovery or notification. This is where that initial report comes into play.
So that's the trigger. Someone sees something, makes the call, and then, sets the wheels in motion.
Exactly. That kicks off phase 2, preliminary assessment and initiation of action. Experts assess the situation, determine the severity of the spill, and decide if a full-blown response is necessary.
So not every spill is going to trigger, a massive cleanup operation, an evaluation process, to determine the right level of response.
Exactly. If they determine a significant response is needed, then you move into phase 3, containment, countermeasures, cleanup, and disposal. This is where you see those images of booms being deployed to contain the oil, skimmers removing it from the water surface, all those other efforts to mitigate the damage.
Okay, so it sounds like a pretty intense and complex operation.
It can be. And then finally, once the immediate threat is addressed, you move into phase 4, documentation and cost recovery. This phase focuses on assessing the long-term impacts, documenting the entire response process, and figuring who's responsible for footing the bill.
Makes sense. You have to, figure out who's going to pay for all this, I imagine. There are probably multiple spills happening at any given time. So how do they decide which ones get priority?
That's where the national response priorities come in. The NCP uses these priorities to help determine, which spills pose the most substantial threat and require immediate action. It considers factors like the potential harm to human health, the impact on sensitive environments, and the overall scale of the spill.
So it's not just a first-come, first-served system.
Right.
There's a whole process for evaluating the risks, deciding which spills deserve the most urgent attention.
Exactly. And those priorities are constantly being reevaluated as the situation evolves.
Okay.
Now, so far we've been talking mostly about oil spills, but the NCP also covers hazardous substances, and those often require a slightly different approach.
Okay. So let's switch gears and talk about how the plan tackles those situations.
Yeah.
What are some of the key differences in responding to a hazardous substance release versus an oil spill?
Well, For hazardous substances, the initial focus is on something called a removal site evaluation. This involves quickly assessing the situation to determine if immediate action, known as removal actions, are needed.
So it's all about determining if there's an immediate threat
Yeah.
that needs to be contained right away.
Exactly. Think of a scenario where you have leaking chemical drums, The priority is to contain that leak as quickly as possible to prevent further spread and minimize exposure to people and the environment.
Okay, so you're dealing with a potentially more localized, but maybe even more acutely dangerous situation. What happens after those initial removal actions? Is that the end of the story?
Not necessarily. While some situations might be resolved with those initial actions, others may require a longer-term approach, known as remedial actions. This involves more comprehensive cleanup efforts to address any remaining contamination and restore the site to a safe condition.
So it's a two-pronged approach. Address the immediate danger and then implement a longer-term plan to fully remediate the site.
Exactly, and to help prioritize those longer-term cleanup efforts, the NCP utilizes something called the National Priorities List, or NTL.
The NPL. That's the infamous list of the most contaminated sites in the country, right?
That's the one. It's a constantly evolving list based on the level of contamination and the potential risk to human health and the environment. Sites on the NPL are eligible for federal funding for long-term cleanup efforts.
So it's like tracking the environmental most wanted list.
Yeah.
But with a focus on cleaning up those sites.
Yeah.
And mitigating the risks they pose.
Yeah.
That's fascinating how the NCP goes beyond just responding to immediate emergencies. It's really a long-term plan to protect both human health and the environment.
It is. And there's another aspect of the plan that goes beyond the immediate cleanup, the protection of natural resources.
Yeah, that's right. We touched on that earlier. Tell me more about how the NCP ensures those resources are protected and restored after a spill or release.
Well, the NCP designates trustees for natural resources. These are individuals or agencies who are responsible for assessing the damage to the environment and developing plans for restoration.
So they're not just cleaning up the oil or the hazardous substance. They're looking at the bigger picture, the impact on the entire ecosystem.
Exactly. They're looking at the impacts on wildlife, plants, habitats, the whole interconnected web of life in the affected area.
So it's like having environmental guardians who are tasked with ensuring those natural resources aren't just forgotten in the chaos of a spill response.
That's a great way to put it. They have the authority to conduct damage assessments, develop restoration plans, and even seek compensation from the responsible parties to fund those restoration efforts.
So they have some real teeth when it comes to making sure the environment is properly taken care of. Now, what about the people living in these areas affected by spills or releases? Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, public involvement is a core principle of the NCP. It emphasizes the importance of keeping communities informed and engaged throughout the entire response process.
Because ultimately, it's the people living in these areas who are most directly impacted by these events.
Absolutely. They have the right to know what's happening, what risks they might be facing, and what's being done to address the situation.
So it's about transparency and giving communities a voice in the process.
Exactly. The NCP mandates that communities have access to information about the spill or release, the planned response actions, and any potential health risks. It also outlines procedures for community involvement, such as public meetings and opportunities to provide input on cleanup plans.
Okay, that's encouraging to hear. It sounds like the NCP really tries to strike a balance between responding to emergencies effectively and ensuring that communities are kept in the loop and given a chance to participate.
It does. And that community involvement can be incredibly valuable. Local residents often have a deep understanding of the area, its resources, and its vulnerabilities.
Yeah, they bring a unique perspective that outside experts might not have.
Exactly. And the NCP recognizes the importance of tapping into that local knowledge and incorporating community concerns and feedback into the decision-making process.
Makes a lot of sense. You're more likely to get buy-in and cooperation if people feel like they're being heard and their concerns are being addressed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, one topic that often generates a lot of discussion and sometimes controversy is the use of dispersants in oil spill responses.
Dispersants, those are the chemicals they use to break down the oil, right?
That's right. They're designed to break the oil slick into smaller droplets, which can then be more easily diluted and dispersed by natural processes.
I can see why they'd be considered controversial.
Yeah.
You're essentially introducing another chemical into the environment. And that raises questions about potential impacts on marine life. So how does the NCP address those concerns?
Well, first off, the NCP doesn't take the use of dispersants lightly. It outlines a very strict authorization process,
Yeah.
with numerous factors considered before they're even allowed to be used.
So it's not a decision that's made haphazardly. There's a whole evaluation process involved.
Exactly. They have to consider the specific characteristics of the oil, the environmental conditions, the potential impacts on marine life, and even the effectiveness of the dispersant in those particular conditions. It's a multifaceted evaluation.
I imagine they also have to consider the potential trade-offs, weighing the benefits of dispersing the oil against any potential negative impacts from the dispersant itself.
Absolutely. It's a complex decision-making process. And even if dispersants are authorized for use, the NCP mandates strict monitoring and data collection after they're applied. They need to assess the effectiveness of the treatment and track any potential environmental impacts.
So it's not just a case of spray and forget. There's a lot of accountability built into the process.
That's right. And speaking of accountability, the NCP also has a very specific process for approving the dispersants themselves. They have to meet strict criteria in terms of effectiveness and environmental safety.
Okay, so tell me more about the PISTER, that approval process. What kind of hurdles does a dispersant have to clear before it can be used in a spill response?
Well, the NCP maintains something called the NCP product schedule. It's basically a list of approved dispersants and other agents that have met specific testing requirements.
So there's a whole separate list for these products. What kind of testing is involved?
The testing is quite rigorous. They have to evaluate the dispersant's effectiveness in breaking down different types of oil under various conditions.
So they're not just looking at how well it works in a lab setting. They're trying to simulate real-world conditions.
Exactly. They also have to assess the dispersant's toxicity to marine life. They use standardized tests to determine how different species react to different concentrations of the dispersant.
I see.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to solve one environmental problem by creating another.
Precisely. And it's not just a pass-fail test. They look at a range of factors, like how the dispersant affects the growth, reproduction, and survival of different marine organisms. It's a very comprehensive evaluation.
It sounds like they're leaving no stone unturned
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to assessing the safety and effectiveness of these dispersants.
That's the goal. And they're constantly updating the testing protocols. As new scientific knowledge emerges, they're always looking for ways to improve the process and make sure they're using the best available science to make these decisions.
This is all really fascinating. It's clear that a lot of thought and effort goes into every aspect of the NCP. It's Camille Light's plan, but it seems like it's designed to be
Yes.
as thorough and responsive as possible.
It is. And there's one more section of the plan I think you'll find particularly intriguing, the part dedicated specifically to handling radioactive substances.
Okay, radioactive substances, now we're getting into some really specialized territory. What makes these situations unique, and how does the NCP approach them differently?
Well, radioactive substances present a unique set of challenges. They can pose long-term risks to human health and the environment, and they require specialized handling and containment procedures.
So it's not just about cleaning up a spill, it's about managing those long-term risks.
Exactly. And to assess those risks, the NCP uses a modified version of the hazard ranking system, or HRS. This modified system takes into account the unique properties of radioactive substances.
We talked about the HRS earlier.
Yeah.
In relation to prioritizing hazardous substance sites, how is this modified version different?
The modified HRS for radioactive substances considers factors like the type of radiation emitted, the half-life of the substance, and its potential to accumulate in the food chain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are all factors that wouldn't necessarily apply to, a typical chemical spill.
Yeah.
It makes sense that they need a more specialized system for evaluating those risks.
They do. And this modified HRS is crucial for determining the level of response required and prioritizing cleanup efforts for sites contaminated with radioactive materials.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored the organizational structure of the NCP, the phased approach to oil spill response, the importance of public involvement, the intricacies of using dispersants, and the specialized considerations for handling radioactive substances.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in this fascinating document.
Well, then let's keep diving. Stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive into the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan. We'll delve even deeper into the science behind the plan, the specific testing protocols for dispersants, and the complex calculations of the hazard ranking system. Welcome back. Last time we were talking about how the NCP goes about approving dispersants and other agents for oil spill response. That whole NCP product schedule thing, it sounds like a pretty rigorous process.
It really is. The ECFR, where the NCP is documented, lays out some seriously specific testing protocols. You can think of it as a multi-step science experiment to ensure these products are both effective and safe for the environment.
Okay, walk me through it. What are some of the key tests they use?
Well, one of the most important is the baffled flask dispersant efficacy test. It sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty straightforward. They're measuring how well a product breaks down oil in seawater. They actually use a special flask with baffles to mimic the turbulent conditions of the ocean.
Oh, okay. So they're not just mixing oil and dispersant in a beaker. They're trying to replicate the real-world environment where these products would be used.
Exactly. And that's crucial because, those turbulent conditions play a big role in how effectively a dispersant can break down the oil. But it's not just about efficacy. They also have to consider the potential impact on marine life.
Right. Because we don't want to solve one environmental problem by creating another.
Yeah.
So how do they go about assessing the toxicity of these products?
They use a combination of lab tests and computer modeling to predict how the dispersant might affect different marine organisms. Two species commonly used in these tests are the silverside fish and the mysid shrimp. They expose them to varying concentrations of the dispersant and monitor their behavior, growth, and survival rates.
So they're trying to get a sense of how different levels of exposure might impact those key species. But the ocean is a complex ecosystem with countless species. How can they be sure those tests are representative of the broader impact?
That's a great question. And it's a challenge scientists are constantly grappling with. They use a variety of techniques to try to extrapolate from those lab tests to the broader ecosystem. They also look at things like the dispersant's chemical composition, breaking it down into its individual components, and assessing the potential toxicity of each one.
So they're not just looking at the product as a whole, they're getting down to the molecular level to understand its potential impacts.
Exactly. And they pay particular attention to certain compounds, like hydrocarbons and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAH.
PAHs. Those are known to be pretty harmful, right?
Many of them are. Some are carcinogenic, meaning they can cause cancer, and others can have various other toxic effects on marine life. So the NCP sets strict limits on the concentrations of these compounds allowed in approved dispersants.
So it sounds like they're really trying to strike that balance, finding products that are effective at breaking down the oil, but don't pose an unacceptable risk to the environment.
That's the ongoing challenge. And it's a complex one. There are always trade-offs to consider. And the science is constantly evolving. But the rigorous testing and evaluation procedures outlined in the NCP are designed to help make those decisions as informed as possible.
So it's a constantly evolving process as new information emerges and new technologies become available.
Exactly. Now, beyond, the specific tests we've discussed, there's also a heavy emphasis on documentation and standardization throughout the entire process. Every step from collecting the samples to analyzing the data is meticulously documented following very specific standard operating procedures, or SOPs.
SOPs. So there's a standard procedure for everything.
Pretty much. It's all about ensuring consistency and quality control. If everyone is following the same procedures, it makes it easier to compare results across different labs and studies, and it helps ensure that the data is reliable and can be used to make informed decisions.
So it's not just about the science itself. It's about the process, the rigor, and the attention to detail.
Absolutely. And remember, all of this we've been discussing is just for dispersants. The NCP also covers other types of agents used in oil spill response, like bioremediation agents.
Bioremediation agents, those sound a bit more eco-friendly. What are they?
So bioremediation agents harness the power of nature to help clean up oil spills. They introduce naturally occurring microorganisms into the environment that are capable of breaking down oil and other contaminants. It's like giving nature a helping hand to speed up the natural biodegradation process.
So instead of using harsh chemicals, you're using nature's own cleanup crew.
Exactly. It's a more sustainable approach. And it can be very effective in certain situations. The NCP outlines specific guidelines for the use of bioremediation agents, including testing protocols to ensure they're safe and effective for the environment.
It's fascinating how even within the NCP, there's this push toward finding more environmentally friendly solutions.
There is. And while we're on the topic of different types of response tools, the NCP also covers sorbent materials, which are essentially like sponges designed to soak up oil. They even have a separate sorbent product list.
So there's a list for just about everything. What kind of materials are we talking about?
The list includes a wide range of materials, from natural ones, like feathers, cork, and wool, to synthetic ones, specifically engineered for oil absorption.
So there's a whole spectrum of options, from low-tech to high-tech.
Right, and just like with dispersants, the NCP sets standards for the effectiveness and safety of sorbents. They have to go through testing to ensure they can actually absorb oil effectively and that they don't leach harmful chemicals into the environment.
It's really impressive how much detail and thought goes into every aspect of this plan. It's like they've tried to anticipate every possible scenario and develop a protocol for handling it.
That's the goal. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The NCP recognizes that every spill is unique, and the response needs to be tailored to the specific circumstances.
So it's a framework for making informed decisions, not a rigid set of rules.
Exactly. And that brings us back to one of the tools we discussed earlier, the hazard ranking system, or HRS. This is a key part of the NCP's decision-making process, especially when it comes to prioritizing cleanup efforts for sites contaminated with hazardous substances.
We touched on the HRS briefly in the last part, but let's delve a bit deeper. How does this system actually work?
The HRS is essentially a scientific method for assessing the potential risks posed by hazardous substance release. It uses a complex algorithm to assign a score to a site based on various factors.
So it's not just a gut feeling, it's a data-driven approach to evaluating the risk.
Exactly. And that's important because there are so many contaminated sites across the country, and resources for cleanup are limited, so they need a system for determining which sites pose the greatest risk and require the most urgent attention.
What are some of the key factors that go into that calculation?
So the HRS looks at things like the toxicity of the substance, how much of it was released, how easily it can spread through the environment, whether it's likely to contaminate drinking water sources, and how many people might be exposed.
So it's like a giant risk assessment puzzle, taking all those pieces into account to get a clear picture of the potential threat.
That's a great analogy. And based on the HRS score, a site is placed on the National Priorities List, or NPL. Sites with the highest scores are considered the most dangerous and are given top priority for cleanup.
So the NPL isn't just a random list, it's a ranking based on this scientific assessment of the risks.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about the modified HRS for radioactive substances?
Yeah, one that takes into account unique properties of those substances.
Right. For those situations, the calculations get even more complex because you have to consider things like the type of radiation emitted, the half-life of the substance, and its potential to bioaccumulate in the food chain.
Bioaccumulate. That's when a substance builds up in organisms over time, right?
Exactly. And with radioactive substances, that bioaccumulation can be particularly dangerous because it can lead to long-term exposure and health risks, even if the initial levels of contamination weren't very high.
So the modified HRS tries to account for all of those long-term risks. It's amazing how much scientific detail and complexity goes into this entire process.
It is. And it really highlights the commitment to protecting public health and the environment, even in the face of these complex and challenging situations.
Yeah, it's reassuring to know that there's this level of scientific rigor behind the decisions being made.
It is. Now, one aspect of the NCP that often gets overlooked is the role of natural resource trustees. We mentioned them briefly earlier, but I think it's worth delving a bit deeper into their role.
Yes. Let's talk more about them. We know they're responsible for protecting and restoring natural resources after a spill or release. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, their job starts with assessing the damage. They conduct thorough investigations to determine the extent of the contamination, the impacts on wildlife and habitats, and the overall ecological damage.
So they're like environmental detectives, piecing together the clues to understand the full scope of the impact.
Exactly. And once they have a clear picture of the damage, they develop plans for restoration. This might involve things like cleaning up the oil or hazardous substance, rehabilitating injured wildlife, replanting vegetation, or even creating new habitats to compensate for those that were lost.
Wow, so they're not just cleaning up the mess, they're actively working to bring the environment back to life.
That's a great way to put it. They're really focused on the long-term health of the ecosystem, and they have a lot of tools at their disposal. You know, they can work with government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and even private companies to implement those restoration plans.
So it sounds like a very collaborative process.
It is. And the trustees also have the authority to seek compensation from the responsible parties to fund those restoration efforts.
So they have some real power behind them. They're not just making recommendations. They can actually hold those polluters accountable for the damage they've caused.
Exactly. And that's a crucial part of the NCP's overall goal of protecting the environment. It's not just about responding to spills, it's about making sure those responsible are held accountable and that the environment is restored as much as possible.
It's reassuring to know that.
Yeah,
There are these dedicated individuals working tirelessly to protect our natural resources.
it is. They play a vital role in ensuring that we don't just clean up the mess, but we also take steps to restore the health of our planet. Now, we've talked a lot about the technical aspects of the NCP, but there's another element that's just as important, the role of the public.
Yes. We touched on public involvement earlier. Let's talk more about how communities can participate in this process.
So public involvement is woven throughout the entire NCP. From reporting spills to providing input on cleanup plans, the public has a voice in the process. And for good reason. After all, it's the people living in these areas who are most directly affected by spills and releases.
Yeah, it's their lives and livelihoods
Yeah.
that are at stake.
Exactly. And the NCP recognizes that. It mandates that communities have access to information about the incident, the response actions, and any potential health risks.
So it's about transparency
Yeah.
and giving people the information they need to make informed decisions about their own safety and well-being.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just providing information. The NCP also encourages communities to actively participate in the response.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, it can take many forms. Communities can participate in public meetings to learn more about the response and provide feedback. They can volunteer to assist with cleanup efforts. They can share their local knowledge of the area, which can be invaluable to responders.
So it's about turning those affected by these incidents
Yeah.
into active participants in the solution.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly empowering for communities. It gives them a sense of ownership over the process and helps ensure that their concerns are addressed.
So it's not just a top-down approach. It's about collaboration and partnership between responders, government agencies, and the affected communities.
Exactly. And that collaborative approach is really at the heart of the NCP. It's a recognition that we all have a role to play in protecting our environment and responding to these types of emergencies.
Well said. It's been fascinating to delve into the intricate details of the NCP. We've covered so much ground, from the science behind dispersants to the complex calculations of the hazard ranking system and the vital role of natural resource trustees.
There's still more to explore.
There is. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll take a closer look at the role of states in implementing the NCP and discuss some of the broader challenges and opportunities facing this crucial plan. As we move forward, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the NCP. We've covered so much ground, from the intricate science behind dispersants to the critical role of those environmental guardians, the natural resource trustees.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. We've seen how the plan tackles everything, from oil spills to hazardous substance releases, with a focus on both immediate response and long-term restoration.
And we talked about how important it is to involve the public in the process, making sure communities have a voice and feel empowered. But I'm curious, what about the role of individual states? Where do they fit into this whole federal plan?
That's a great question. The NCP isn't just a top-down federal program. It's actually a framework for collaboration between federal, state, and even local agencies. States play a crucial role in implementing the NCP.
So it's not just a bunch of federal agents swooping in and taking over.
Not at all. States have their own environmental agencies and response teams, and they often work in close coordination with federal counterparts. In fact, for certain incidents, states can actually take the lead in the response, with federal agencies providing support.
So it's a true partnership. That makes sense, especially considering how different environmental conditions and challenges can be from one state to another. States probably have a much better understanding of their own unique ecosystems and vulnerabilities.
Exactly. They bring a lot of local expertise to the table. And that state-level involvement isn't limited to just the immediate response phase. States also play a key role in long-term cleanup and monitoring of contaminated sites.
So they're in it for the long haul, working to make sure those sites are restored and the risks are mitigated. It sounds like the NCP really emphasizes this idea of shared responsibility and collaboration.
It does, and that collaborative spirit is essential for ensuring a successful response.
Yeah.
You need everyone working together, federal agencies, state agencies, local communities, even private industry, all pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, it's a reminder that protecting the environment isn't just the government's job. It's a collective responsibility. Now, throughout our deep dive, we've seen how comprehensive and complex the NCP is. But I imagine there are still challenges. and areas for improvement.
There are, like any plan. The NCP isn't perfect. It's constantly evolving as we learn more about environmental contaminants and how to best address them.
What are some of the key challenges the NCP faces today?
Well, one challenge is simply keeping up with the pace of change. The world is changing rapidly, with new technologies, new industries, and new environmental threats emerging. All the time, the NCP has to adapt and evolve to stay ahead of those changes.
It's like a constant game of catch-up.
It can be. Another challenge is finding the right balance between being comprehensive and being flexible. The NCP needs to provide clear guidance and protocols, but it also needs to be flexible enough to adapt to unique situations.
Because no two skills are exactly alike.
Right. And then there's always the challenge of resources. Responding to these incidents and cleaning up contaminated sites can be incredibly expensive, and there's never enough money to go around.
So it's about prioritizing and making tough choices about where to allocate those limited resources.
Exactly. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of climate change, which is adding another layer of complexity to the whole equation.
Climate change, that's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's impacting everything, including how we respond to
Yeah.
environmental emergencies.
It is. Climate change is leading to more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and changes in ecosystems, all of which can exacerbate the impacts of spills and releases.
So the NCP needs to be climate ready,
Yeah.
able to adapt to those changing conditions.
Absolutely. And there's a growing recognition of that need. We're seeing more emphasis on incorporating climate change projections into risk assessments, developing strategies for responding to spills in more extreme weather conditions,
Yeah.
even exploring nature-based solutions for mitigating the impacts of spills.
Nature-based solutions. That sounds interesting. What are some examples?
Well, one example is using coastal wetlands to help absorb and filter contaminants from spills. Wetlands can act like natural sponges, removing pollutants from the water and preventing them from spreading further.
So we can actually harness the power of nature to help clean up the messes we create.
Exactly. And that approach aligns perfectly with the NCP's focus on protecting and restoring natural resources. It's about working with nature, not against it.
We've talked a lot about the challenges, but what about the opportunities? Are there any areas where you see the NCP making significant progress or potential for innovation?
Definitely. One area where I see a lot of potential is in the use of technology. New technologies like drones, sensors, and advanced modeling techniques are revolutionizing how we respond to spills and monitor the environment.
It's like giving responders a whole new set of tools to work with.
Exactly. Drones can be used to quickly assess the extent of a spill. Sensors can provide real-time data on water quality and contaminant levels. Advanced models can help predict how a spill might spread and what the potential impacts might be.
It sounds like we're moving towards a more data-driven and proactive approach to spill response.
We are, and that's really exciting because it allows us to make more informed decisions, respond more quickly and effectively, and potentially even prevent some spills from happening in the first place.
Prevention, that's the ultimate goal, isn't it?
It is. And while the NCP will always have a role to play in responding to spills, there's a growing emphasis on prevention. That means working with industries to improve safety protocols, investing in infrastructure to reduce the risk of spills, and promoting responsible environmental practices.
So it's about shifting from a reactive approach
Yeah.
to a more proactive one, trying to stop spills before they happen.
Exactly. And that shift requires a collective effort. It's not just up to the government. It's up to all of us, individuals, communities, businesses, and policymakers, to work together to create a more sustainable and resilient future.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan. It's a complex and ever-evolving document, but it's clear that it plays a vital role in protecting our environment and public health.
It does, and it's a testament to our commitment to addressing these challenges head-on and working together to find solutions.
We hope you've gained a newfound appreciation for the NCP, its intricacies, its challenges, and its ultimate goal of safeguarding our planet.
And we encourage you to stay informed, get involved, and be part of the solution.
That's right, because protecting our environment is a shared responsibility. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.